My name is Rourke Whitmore. I'm 41 years old, and for the last 10 years I worked as a contract coordinator for a logistics company in Minneapolis, Minnesota. My job was simple: keep everything legal, even when nobody was paying attention. I wasn't the flashiest guy in the office. I didn't chase promotions or fight for recognition. I just solved problems before they became disasters, quietly, efficiently. That was my specialty. I was the one they called when a supplier threatened to pull out of a deal, or when a clause in a contract looked suspicious. I'd spent a decade building a reputation as the guy who kept operations compliant, who made sure we didn't step on legal landmines. I never asked for credit. I just did the work, and for years that was enough. My boss, Grant Huxley, was a different kind of professional. He was 47, charismatic, the type who knew how to smile in meetings and take credit for other people's work. He'd built his career on looking good while others carried the weight, and I was one of those others. Every time I flagged a problem, every time I fixed something that could have turned into a lawsuit, Grant was the one who presented it to the board as his own foresight. I didn't mind much. I wasn't interested in politics. I just wanted to do my job right. If you enjoy stories of cold-blooded revenge and gripping plot twists, like this video, and subscribe to the channel now. There are brand new unreleased stories here every day, each one more intense than the last. But then came the day that changed everything. It was a Wednesday afternoon in early October 2025. My sister Marla was scheduled for a delicate medical procedure at Abbott Northwestern Hospital. Nothing life-threatening, but serious enough that she needed someone there. Her husband was out of state on business, so I took the day off to help with the kids and stay at the hospital during the surgery. My nephews, 8 and 11, were scared. I kept them distracted with card games in the waiting room, checking my phone every few minutes for updates from the surgical team. That's when the message came through. Not a call, not an email marked urgent, just a text message from Grant's number. Your position has been terminated. HR will be in touch. 14 words. 10 years of service reduced to a single line that didn't even deserve a phone call. I read it twice, thinking maybe I'd misunderstood. But there was no misunderstanding. I'd been fired by text message while sitting in a hospital waiting room with my sister's kids. I didn't react, not outwardly. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, smiled at my nephews, and kept playing cards. But inside, something shifted, because the timing wasn't random. It was surgical. Calculated. And I knew exactly why. 3 weeks earlier, our company had been finalizing a massive logistics expansion contract, multi-million-dollar deal, new distribution hubs across the Midwest. Grant had been pushing it hard, positioning himself as the architect of the whole operation. It was supposed to be his crowning achievement, the project that would get him promoted to VP. There was just one problem. The contract had a critical flaw in its liability clause, a poorly worded section that transferred undue risk to our company. If something went wrong, if a shipment was delayed or damaged under certain conditions outlined in that clause, we'd be on the hook for penalties that could run into the hundreds of thousands, maybe more. I'd flagged it, sent Grant a detailed memo outlining the issue, suggesting we renegotiate that section before signing. His response had been brief and dismissive. Don't create obstacles, Rourke. This deal is already done. But it wasn't done. It was dangerous, and I was the only one who seemed to care about that danger. Now I understood. I wasn't fired because of budget cuts or restructuring. I was fired because I knew too much, because I was the one voice that could slow down Grant's big moment. He needed that contract signed fast, and he needed me gone before I could make any more noise about it. So he pulled the trigger on the worst possible day, in the worst possible way. A text message. No explanation. No decency. Just erasure. That night, after Marla was out of surgery and resting comfortably, after I'd gotten the boys home and settled, I sat alone in my apartment in the uptown neighborhood of Minneapolis. The place was quiet. Too quiet. I poured myself 2 fingers of bourbon, sat at my kitchen table, and stared at that text message again. 14 words. I could feel the anger building, but I didn't let it take over. Anger makes you sloppy, Anger makes you emotional, and emotional people make mistakes. I'd learned a long time ago that the best defense in contract law wasn't aggression. It was documentation, facts, evidence, things that couldn't be argued away or spun into a different story. So instead of calling Grant and screaming at him, instead of posting angry rants on social media, or badmouthing the company to former colleagues, I did what I do best. I got methodical. I opened my laptop and went through my files. Over the years, I'd kept copies of everything. Not because I was paranoid, but because in my line of work, you never knew when you'd need proof of what was actually said versus what people claimed was said. Emails, contract drafts, revision histories, meeting notes. I had it all organized in folders by project and date, and sitting right there in my September 2025 folder was the original version of that logistics expansion contract. The one with the problematic liability clause fully visible and documented. The version dated and digitally signed before Grant had started pushing for simplifications. I also had the email chain, the one where I'd explicitly warned Grant about the risks. My memo was clear, professional, and specific. I'd outlined exactly what could go wrong, provided cost estimates for potential penalties, and recommended specific language changes to protect the company. His response was equally clear. Stop overthinking this, we need to move forward. There was another email too from 2 weeks before my termination, where he'd asked me to stop flagging minor issues that slow down approvals. Minor issues. That's what he'd called a clause that could cost the company a fortune. I made copies of everything, saved them to 3 different locations, an external hard drive, a cloud storage account, and a USB drive that I kept in my car. Then I did something I'd never done before in my entire career. I contacted the Minnesota Department of Transportation's Freight and Logistics Regulatory Division. Our expansion contract involved interstate shipping agreements and state infrastructure usage. That meant it fell under their jurisdiction for compliance review. I didn't make a complaint. I didn't name names or accuse anyone of wrongdoing. I simply submitted what they call a technical advisory notice. It's a formal communication that any industry professional can file when they identify potential regulatory concerns in pending contracts. I attached the original contract version, highlighted the liability clause, and provided a detailed technical analysis of why that language created legal exposure under Minnesota commercial transportation law. I cited specific statutes, referenced similar cases, and laid out the potential financial and operational consequences. Everything was factual. Everything was documented. Everything was impossible to dismiss as opinion or hearsay. I sent it at 11:37 p.m. on that Wednesday night. Then I closed my laptop, finished my bourbon, and went to bed. I slept better than I had in weeks. The response came faster than I expected. By Friday afternoon, 48 hours after I'd filed my notice, the regulatory division issued what's called a precautionary suspension order. It's not a full stop, but it's close. It meant the contract couldn't be executed until a complete compliance review was conducted. The state wanted answers. They wanted documentation. They wanted to see every draft, every revision, every communication about that liability clause. And they wanted it within 10 business days. I found out about the order the same way everyone else did, through the industry newsletter that hit my inbox at 4 p.m. Major Midwest Logistics Expansion placed on regulatory hold, read the headline. The article didn't name our company specifically, but anyone in the industry knew which deal they were talking about. It was the only expansion of that size in the pipeline. I could picture the chaos at the office, the emergency meetings, the panicked phone calls to legal, and Grant sitting in his corner office trying to figure out how everything had fallen apart so quickly. What Grant didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd been preparing for this possibility for weeks. Not because I planned to be fired, but because I'd learned long ago that in contract coordination, you always have a backup plan. You always document your warnings. You always cover your professional liability. It's not paranoia. It's survival. The first call came on Saturday morning, unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. It was someone from HR asking me to call back, regarding my separation paperwork. I deleted it. The second call came Sunday evening. Grant's number. I watched it ring through to voicemail. He didn't leave a message. The third call came Monday morning from a number I didn't recognize. This time I answered. It was Patricia Voss, the company's general counsel. I'd worked with her a few times over the years. She was sharp, no nonsense, and she didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Rourke," she said, "we need to talk about the regulatory hold on the Midwest expansion contract." "I'm no longer employed by the company," I replied calmly. "I'm not sure how I can help you." "Don't play games," she said, and I could hear the tension in her voice. "You filed that technical advisory notice. Your name is on the submission." "I filed it as a private citizen," I said, "as someone with expertise in logistics contract compliance, which, as I'm sure you know, is completely legal. The state specifically allows industry professionals to flag regulatory concerns." There was a long pause. "You could have come to me first." "I did come to someone first," I said. "I came to Grant 3 weeks ago, with a detailed memo outlining the exact same concerns. He told me to stop creating obstacles." Another pause. Longer this time. "We're conducting an internal review." "That's good," I said. "You should. That clause is a liability nightmare." "This isn't over, Rourke." "No," I agreed. "It's not, but it's not my problem anymore either." I hung up. That's when I knew I'd hit the nerve I was aiming for. Because Patricia Voss didn't make calls like that unless the situation was serious. And if she was calling me, it meant the board had questions. Big questions. Questions that Grant couldn't answer without throwing himself under the bus. The following Tuesday, the news broke publicly. Our company issued a statement saying the Midwest expansion project was being temporarily paused for routine regulatory review. Anyone who understood corporate language knew what that meant. The deal was in trouble. By Wednesday, the trade publications were running stories speculating about what had gone wrong. By Thursday, investors were asking questions on the quarterly earnings call. The stock dipped 3% in a single day. Not catastrophic, but enough to get the board's attention. I watched it all unfold from my apartment, drinking coffee and scrolling through news alerts on my phone. I wasn't celebrating. I wasn't gloating. I was just observing. Because this wasn't about revenge in the emotional sense. It was about consequences. Grant had made a choice to ignore a serious problem because acknowledging it would have been inconvenient. He'd made another choice to fire me in the cruelest way possible because I represented an obstacle to his ambitions. Now, he was dealing with the natural outcome of those choices. What happened next I only learned about later through a former colleague who still worked in the legal department. Apparently, the board convened an emergency meeting the day after the stock drop. They wanted answers. They wanted to know who had signed off on a contract with such obvious flaws. They wanted to know why their general counsel hadn't caught it. And most importantly, they wanted to know why a terminated employee had been the one to flag the issue with regulators instead of someone still on the payroll. Grant tried to control the narrative. According to my source, he claimed the regulatory hold was a misunderstanding, and that the clause in question was standard industry language that I had misinterpreted due to lack of executive-level perspective. He suggested I'd filed the notice out of spite after my termination, trying to damage the company. He positioned himself as the victim of a disgruntled former employee. But Patricia Voss had done her homework. She'd pulled my original memo. She'd reviewed the email chains. She'd compared the contract versions and seen exactly when and how that liability clause had been modified. And she'd found something else, an internal email from Grant to the contracts team, dated 2 days after my warning, instructing them to streamline the language in Section 12 without changing the fundamental terms. Section 12 was the liability clause. He hadn't just ignored my warning, he'd actively worked to obscure the problem. The board asked Grant to explain. He couldn't, not without admitting he'd prioritized speed over safety, appearance over substance. He tried to deflect, saying he'd relied on the judgment of his team, that these decisions were collaborative. But the paper trail didn't support that story. Every decision to push forward despite red flags came back to him. Every instruction to bypass proper review had his signature on it. By the end of that week, Grant was placed on administrative leave pending a full internal audit. The announcement was buried in a company-wide email about organizational adjustments, but everyone knew what it meant. The golden boy who'd spent years climbing the ladder on other people's work had finally been caught, and the ladder was collapsing beneath him. Meanwhile, something unexpected happened to me. I got a LinkedIn message from a man named Richard Castellano. He was the director of risk management at a specialized compliance consulting firm based in Chicago. His message was direct. "I read your technical advisory submission to the Minnesota DOT. Impressive work. We should talk." I called him that afternoon. Richard got straight to the point. His firm worked with logistics companies, manufacturers, and distributors to review contracts and ensure regulatory compliance before deals were finalized. They were looking for someone with deep expertise in transportation law and a track record of identifying problems before they became lawsuits. Someone who understood that the most expensive mistakes were the ones you didn't catch until after signing. "I saw what you flagged in that Midwest contract," Richard said. "That wasn't just competent, that was exceptional. You probably saved that company millions in penalties and litigation costs, even if they don't realize it yet." "They fired me for it," I said. "I know," Richard replied. "I also know you did it anyway. That tells me you have integrity. And integrity is expensive to find in this industry." He offered me a position as a senior compliance analyst. The salary was $87,000 annually, 38% higher than the $63,000 I'd been making in Minneapolis. The benefits were better, and most importantly, the culture was different. This was a firm that valued the people who asked hard questions, not the ones who buried them. I accepted the offer the next day. I gave myself 2 weeks before starting the new job. Used the time to help Marla with the kids while she recovered, to organize my apartment, and to process everything that had happened. I didn't contact anyone from my old company, didn't send goodbye emails or try to reconnect with former colleagues. I just moved forward, quietly, cleanly. But the story at my old company wasn't over. The regulatory review took 3 weeks. When it concluded, the Minnesota DOT issued a formal finding that the original contract language created unacceptable risk exposure and required substantial revision before approval. The company had to bring in outside counsel to renegotiate the entire liability section. The expansion project, which was supposed to launch in November 2025, was pushed back to the following spring. The delays cost approximately $2.4 million in lost revenue and additional legal fees. Grant never returned from administrative leave. In mid-November 2025, the company announced his departure to pursue other opportunities. No farewell party. No press release celebrating his contributions. Just a quiet exit and a severance package that I'm sure came with an ironclad non-disclosure agreement. His LinkedIn profile still listed him as open to opportunities when I checked it weeks later. I found out through that same colleague in legal that during the internal audit, they discovered other instances where Grant had cut corners. Contracts approved without proper review. Risk assessments skipped to meet deadlines. Small violations that individually meant nothing, but together painted a picture of someone who cared more about looking successful than being competent. My case wasn't an anomaly. It was just the one that got caught. The company tried to reach out to me once more in early December 2025. Patricia Voss sent an email saying they'd reconsidered my termination and wanted to discuss potential opportunities for return. The offer included back pay for the time I'd been gone and a promotion to senior contract manager. It was a good offer, a generous offer. The kind of offer designed to make a problem go away quietly. I responded with 2 sentences. "Thank you for the offer. I've accepted a position elsewhere." I didn't elaborate, didn't negotiate, didn't leave the door open for future conversations. Because some bridges aren't worth rebuilding. Some chapters need to close completely before new ones can begin. I started my new position in Chicago in late November 2025. The office was in the Loop, a modern building with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan. The team was small, specialized, and everyone there had a similar story. People who'd seen what happened when companies prioritized speed over safety, when executives cared more about quarterly results than long-term stability. We weren't cynics, we were realists. And our job was to be the voice in the room that asked uncomfortable questions before they became catastrophic answers. Richard Castellano turned out to be exactly the kind of boss I'd always needed. He didn't micromanage. He didn't take credit for other people's work. He hired experts and then trusted them to be expert. In my first month, I reviewed 14 contracts for clients across 6 industries. I flagged issues in 9 of them. Not minor issues, real problems. Clauses that would have exposed companies to litigation, regulatory violations that could have triggered federal investigations, liability gaps that could have bankrupted smaller operations. And every single time I raised a concern, Richard backed me up, told the clients, "This is why you hired us." Listen to him. It was a strange feeling at first, being valued for the same qualities that had gotten me fired. But it shouldn't have been strange. It should have been normal. That's what I realized during those first weeks in Chicago. I hadn't been the problem at my old company. The culture had been the problem. A culture that rewarded people like Grant for looking good in meetings while punishing people like me for doing the actual work. Few weeks into my new position, I got an unexpected message. It was from someone named David Kowalski, a name I vaguely recognized but couldn't place. The message said, "You don't know me, but I worked in operations at your former company. I wanted to say thank you." He explained that he'd been one of the logistics coordinators who would have been responsible for executing that Midwest expansion contract. The problematic liability clause would have put him and his entire team at risk. If something had gone wrong with a shipment under those terms, the penalties would have fallen on the operations department. People could have lost their jobs. Careers could have been destroyed. "You saved us," he wrote, "and nobody there even knows it." I read that message 3 times. Then I wrote back, "You don't owe me thanks. I just did what the job required, but I appreciate you telling me." Because that's what it came down to, really. I didn't blow the whistle to be a hero. I didn't file that regulatory notice to destroy Grant's career. I did it because a dangerous contract was about to be executed, and I had the knowledge and documentation to stop it. Everything else, all the consequences that followed, those were just dominoes falling in their natural sequence. I never heard from Grant directly, never got an angry phone call or a threatening email. I assume his lawyers advised him that any contact with me could be used against him in future litigation. Or maybe he just had nothing to say. What could he say? That he was sorry for firing me by text message during a family emergency? That he regretted ignoring warnings that could have saved the company millions? Some apologies are too little and too late to matter. What I did hear, through the industry grapevine, was that Grant struggled to find another executive position. His departure from the company had been too public, too tied to a regulatory scandal. Other firms asked questions, wanted explanations. He eventually took a position at a smaller logistics company in Columbus, Ohio, a significant step down from where he'd been. I didn't feel satisfaction hearing that. I didn't feel vindication. I just felt nothing. His career trajectory wasn't my concern anymore. My sister Marla recovered fully from her surgery. By late November, she was back to her normal routine, and my nephews had stopped asking why Uncle Rourke didn't work at his old job anymore. I told them the truth, in kid-appropriate terms. Sometimes people make unfair decisions, and when that happens, you have to be strong enough to move forward and find something better. They seemed to understand. Looking back now, just over a month later, I realized the whole situation taught me something fundamental about professional revenge. The most effective kind isn't loud or dramatic. It's not about public confrontations or social media exposés. It's about documentation, timing, and letting people face the natural consequences of their own decisions. Grant didn't get destroyed because I attacked him. He got destroyed because I simply revealed what he'd tried to hide. The truth did the rest. I still have that text message saved on my phone. Your position has been terminated. HR will be in touch. 14 words. I keep it not because I'm bitter, but because it reminds me of something important. The way someone treats you in your worst moment tells you everything about their character. Grant showed me his character that day in October, and I responded by showing him mine, not with anger, not with emotion, just with facts, documentation, and a clear understanding that some fights aren't won by throwing punches. They're won by standing still and